Hi students, welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you how to use two types of loops in P5. We're going to learn how to use a while loop and a for loop. You don't have to program for very long before you realize that sometimes programming can be a little bit repetitive. For example, what if I want to draw multiple ellipses or circles across my screen? You can see I have one blue ellipse here. And if I wanted to draw more than that, I would need to copy this line of code here. And if I changed one of the inputs for the ellipse, the X location, you can see I've now drawn a second ellipse to the right of the first. And I could just continue to do that, moving each one over by 50 pixels and start to get a multiple number of ellipses. And I can copy all three lines, paste them again, changing those numbers. So there you go. I have 6 blue circles on the screen, but what if I wanted to fill the entire screen with blue circles? I would have to repeat that line, that ellipse line, many, many times in order to create all the circles. And there's an easier way to do it, and that is to use a loop. Whenever you find yourself needing to repeat the same command over and over again, sometimes with only small changes to, for example, the X and Y location of something, you're going to want to use a loop. So let's get started learning how to use while loops. Let's go ahead back to our sketch and delete all but one of the ellipse commands. We'll just leave that first one in there. And let's make our canvas a little bit bigger. Let's make it wider, 800 by 600. And let's save it as 2 loops. Make sure you're logged in so your work gets saved to the P5 server. Okay, the first loop that we're going to learn is the while loop. Let's put a comment in here. A while loop for drawing circles. The first thing you need to know about a while loop is that you need a counter or some kind of variable that will control the number of times that the loop will repeat. And so we're going to initialize a variable for controlling the loop. And we're going to call that variable x. Okay, so let's go var x and initialize it to 0. In order to use a while loop, we simply type while parentheses, and inside those parentheses is where we put our condition. You're basically saying, while this statement is true, continue looping. And we're going to use x to control our loop, like I said earlier. So we're going to say while x is less than or equal to width. We remember that width is a value built into the P5 canvas, and it represents the width of the canvas, in this case, the 800. Now, as with if statements and other types of control blocks, you need to have a set of parentheses. So we'll put that there and a couple spaces in between. This now represents the body of the while loop. And anything that we want to have repeat needs to go inside there. So we're going to take our ellipse command here and highlight it and click and drag it and put it inside the while loop. Now, we immediately get an error message down here, exiting potential infinite loop at line 12. So we've already run into our problem with our loop. And it says that on line 12, we have a potential infinite loop. An infinite loop is a loop that never ends. And you don't want to have infinite loops. Infinite loops are bad. So the way we avoid a loop is to make sure that this condition that's controlling the loop eventually becomes false. Well, right now, x is got the value of 0. We set that on line 11. And 0 is less than the width of the canvas, which is 800. And it will continue to be less than width unless we change the value of x. So the one thing you have to remember with while loops is you have to always make sure that the condition there eventually becomes false. And the way we do that is just to change the value of x inside the loop. So what we'll do is we'll say x gets x plus some value. We're just going to say plus 40. So now that x is going to change and start at 0 but count up by 40, it will eventually become no longer less than or equal to width. It will eventually become greater than the value of width, which will mean that this while loop will eventually end and it will no longer be an infinite loop. So let's just run this and see if that problem goes away. There you go. Sure enough, our console log no longer states that there is an error, potential error, and that's because we've made sure that this condition eventually becomes false by changing the value of x. Now, we still only have one blue circle on the canvas. And why is that? Well, we actually have a lot of ellipses there. We probably have, I don't know, about 20 ellipses on the screen. We just can't see them. And that's because we're drawing all of them in the same spot. We're all drawing each one at x0, y100, and they're 50 by 50 in terms of size. So now what we can do is use x to change one of these values. So instead of drawing it at 0 every time, let's draw it at x. Remember? Whoa, there you go. They're overlapping slightly because I said the ellipse is 50 by 50. Let's make that circle 40 width and 40 height. And then they'll all just line up perfectly just like that. Because each circle then will have a width of 40, and then each time you go through the loop, the x location changes by 40, so you get a bunch of circles right next to each other. There you go. That's really simply how you use a while loop. And note that you can also change not only the x location of the circles that are being drawn, you could also instead use your x variable to change the y location as well. Now we get a pattern like that. Or what if we only change the y location of the circle? We can get a pattern like that. Okay, let's go ahead and make our ellipses look a little bit better. I'd like to go ahead and give these a stroke of white. You can also use the number 255 in there, or just type the name of the color as well. Let's give it a stroke weight of 3. And I'd also like to print out the value of x inside each of these circles so we can just see exactly what's happening with each of these. So I'm going to print the value of x. We know to do that. We're just going to say text. We want to print the value of x, and we want to put it right in the center of each one of those circles. So again, we'll just use x for the x location and 200 for the y. And now we see we get the number showing up inside the circle. Starts out at 0, 40, 80, 120, 160, etc. In order to get rid of that stroke, however, which makes it difficult to read the text, let's go no stroke right before we write that text there. But now it's drawing it with the same fill as the blue circles, so now we have to again change the fill back to white. That's going to make all the subsequent circles white. That's because we initially set the fill here outside the loop. So let's put it inside the loop here. And now we are going to have the circles filled with blue and the text filled with white, putting a stroke around the circles but not around the text. And again, I'm going to put a comment here. This is incrementing x by 40. If you want that text to show up right in the center of the circle, we can use text align and then all caps center. Now it's really easy to see exactly how we're controlling the drawing of the ellipses using x and how x is changing with each iteration of the loop. We can see we go from 0 all the way out to 800 on the final ellipse. And that's how you use a while loop. Next, I'm going to go on and show you how to use a for loop to draw a different shape going in a different direction. Now the second kind of loop we're going to learn is a for loop. We're going to put it after this while loop. So let's mark the end of the while loop. We don't want to put our for loop inside the while loop, so let's mark that clearly. Now to start the for loop, we are going to use the word for and a set of parentheses for our condition. However, with a for loop, we actually divide the header or the first line of the for loop, into 3 parts. The condition is expressed in 3 parts. First, we declare a variable, and we're just going to call that variable y, and we're going to give it an initial value of 0. Next, we're going to give the conditional portion of this by saying while y is less than or equal to the height, that would be the height of the canvas, and then we're going to increment our y. Y gets y plus 50. And as with the while loop, we need a set of curly braces. So everything we need to control the for loop is stated right here in the head of the for loop. We state the variable, its initial value, the condition of the loop, in other words, when it will end, and how we will increment y. So inside our for loop, we're going to say stroke, set the stroke to a color. How about orange, just for fun? And our fill, 168, 50, 168. Mystery color, we'll see what that is in a second. And what we're going to do is draw a square. And again, we could draw a square at a set position like 0, 300, and give it a size of 40. And now we see all of a sudden there's our square being drawn. However, we only see one square, and that's because, again, like before, we're drawing a bunch of squares, but we're all drawing them all in the same spot. However, if we take our y variable here that's controlling the loop and use it in place of the 300 for the y location of our square, all of a sudden we see now we're drawing a bunch of squares from the top of the screen to the bottom. Each of these squares is size 40, but they're being placed, or y is being incremented by 50 each time. That's why there's a little bit of a gap in between. If we changed the incrementing of y to 40, them each lined up right next to each other. I kind of like that gap in between. If we want to move the squares over a little further, instead of drawing it at x0, let's draw it at x200. Once again, we want to also print the value of y inside the middle of the square. So let's do a fill, change our fill to, again, white, and draw the text. What we want to do is draw the value of y at 300 over, and y on the y-axis. Actually, it's 200 over on the x. If we want to position those numbers right in the center of each square, we can change the way we're drawing the squares, change rect mode to all caps center. And now we're drawing from the center of the rectangle instead of the upper left corner. And text align has already been set to center up on line 20 of our code. And so it's drawing it right in the middle of each square. Perfect. And again, if we want to turn off the stroke, that's no stroke. So there you go. There's your finished drawing. We're using a while loop to draw a series of circles on the x-axis here across the sketch, and we're using a for loop to draw a series of squares down on the y-axis on the sketch. I encourage you to become very familiar with loops, both while loops and for loops in P5. We'll be using them a lot in future programs. I hope you have found this to be helpful. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.